You know how Australia is famous for having the weirdest animals on the planet? Kangaroos that box, platypuses that are basically duck-beaver hybrids with venomous spurs, and spiders the size of dinner plates? Well, imagine all of that, but bigger, but weirder, and isolated for not thousands, not millions, but tens of millions of years. Welcome to prehistoric South America, the continent that evolution apparently forgot to tell about the rules. For roughly 60 million years, this place was completely cut off from the rest of the world. No land bridges, no connections, just a massive island floating in the southern hemisphere, doing its own thing, while the rest of the planet evolved what we'd consider normally. And during that time, South America went absolutely insane. The animals that evolved here were so bizarre that when scientists first discovered their fossils, they genuinely had no idea what they were looking at. Charles Darwin himself collected some of these bones and basically threw his hands up trying to classify them. So today, we're diving into this lost world, a place where birds became the apex predators instead of mammals, where sloths grew to the size of elephants, where armadillos became living tanks, and where the normal animals were anything but. But here's the thing. This isn't just a story about weird creatures. It's a story about what happens when evolution gets 60 million years to experiment in complete isolation, and what happens when that experiment suddenly, catastrophically ends. Let's start with the predators, because in prehistoric South America, the food chain was completely upside down. So picture this. You're a small mammal in South America about 40 million years ago. You're nervously munching on some vegetation when you hear something. Footsteps, heavy ones, getting closer. You look up, expecting maybe a big cat, a wolf-like creature, normal predator stuff. Instead, you see a bird.
But not just any bird. This thing stands 3 meters tall. That's about 10 feet. It weighs over 350 kilograms, roughly 770 pounds. It has legs built like pistons, capable of hitting 48 kilometers per hour, about 30 miles per hour. And its head? Its head is the size of a horse's, equipped with a beak that curves into a vicious hook like an eagle's, except scaled up to absolutely nightmarish proportions. This is Kelenken Guillermoi, and it is about to ruin your entire existence. The terror birds, scientifically known as forest rockets, were the dominant predators of South America for over 50 million years. Let that sink in for a moment. 50 million years. That's longer than the entire existence of most mammal groups. These birds weren't some temporary evolutionary experiment, they were the establishment. See, when the dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago, most continents saw mammals rise to take over the apex predator roles. Big cats, wolves, bears, the usual suspects. But South America said no thanks. Here, it was the birds that stepped up to fill the void, and they were absolutely terrifying. The largest terror bird skull ever found belonged to Kelenken, discovered in Patagonia in 2006. That skull measured 71 centimeters long. That's 28 inches. Just the skull. The beak alone was 46 centimeters, about 18 inches, curved like a meat hook, designed by someone with a very dark imagination. Now, you might be thinking, okay, big bird with a big beak, scary, sure, but how did it actually kill things? And this is where it gets really interesting. Scientists used to assume terror birds killed their prey by biting down on them, like a big cat would. Made sense, right? Big head, big beak, chomp chomp, done. But when researchers actually analyzed the skull structure, they found something completely different. The skulls were incredibly strong when force was applied from the front, but relatively weak from side to side. This means terror birds didn't shake their prey like a dog with a chew toy. Instead, they used their beaks like hatchets. Imagine a 350-kilogram bird sprinting at you at 30 miles per hour, then slamming that massive hooked beak down onto your skull or spine with the force of a pickaxe. Again and again and again. That's how terror birds hunted. They literally hacked their prey to death with their faces. Fun fact, their necks could also extend much further than they appeared. So even if you thought you were at a safe distance, that massive head could suddenly shoot out and strike with terrifying speed. The element of surprise, courtesy of a deceptive neck. Lovely.
Studies of habitat distribution show that terror birds dominated the open grasslands and savannas, the prime real estate for hunting. The mammalian predators that did exist in South America, they were basically forced into the forests to avoid competing with these feathered nightmares. That's right, the mammals were scared of the birds. In South America, the pecking order was literal. But here's the kicker. One species, Titanus walleri, actually migrated north into what is now Florida and Texas after a land bridge formed between the continents. A terror bird in Texas, standing 2 meters tall, walking around the same landscapes that would eventually give us cowboys and barbecue. Talk about a different kind of wildlife problem. And this brings us to our next chapter in South American weirdness, because the terror birds needed something to eat, and what they were eating was just as bizarre as they were. Now, modern sloths are famous for exactly one thing, being slow. They move at about a half a kilometer per hour. They sleep 15 to 20 hours a day. They're so sluggish that algae literally grows on their fur like they're mobile terrariums. So when I tell you that prehistoric South America had sloths the size of elephants, you might picture a really big slow thing. You'd be wrong. Meet Megatherium americanum, the largest ground sloth that ever lived. When standing on its hind legs, this absolute unit reached heights of about 3.5 meters. That's roughly 12 feet tall. It weighed up to 4 tons, about the same as a bull African elephant. Let me say that again because it deserves emphasis. A sloth, the size of an elephant, that could stand up on 2 legs and tower over literally everything around it. The first Megatherium fossil was discovered in 1787 on the banks of the Luján River in Argentina. When the bones arrived in Spain, scientists were completely baffled. The famous French naturalist Georges Cuvier examined them and realized this was some kind of giant sloth, but nothing in his experience prepared him for the sheer scale of the thing. Unlike their tree-dwelling modern cousins, these giant sloths lived entirely on the ground.
But while Megatherium was peacefully munching on high branches, something else was lumbering through the South American landscape. Something that looked like it rolled straight out of a fantasy video game. Imagine an armadillo. Got that picture in your head? Good. Now, make it the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. Give it a shell so thick and solid that nothing could get through it. And then add a tail that ends in a massive club covered in bony spikes. That's Glyptodon. And yes, it was a real animal. These biological tanks reached lengths of over 3 meters, about 10 feet, and weighed up to 2 tons. Their shells weren't made of separate overlapping bands like modern armadillos. Instead, they were fused into a single solid dome of bone covered in smaller bony plates arranged in beautiful geometric rosette patterns. That shell was essentially impenetrable. Nothing in South America had jaws strong enough to crack it. But some glyptodons, like the closely related Duodicarus, took defense one step further. Their tails ended in massive bony clubs studded with spikes. Think medieval Mace, but attached to a 2-ton armored mammal. Now, if you think a tank-like armadillo and an elephant-sized sloth were weird, let me introduce you to something that has absolutely no living relatives whatsoever. Something so bizarre that Charles Darwin couldn't figure out what category of life it belonged to. Meet Toxodon. This thing looked like someone tried to build a rhinoceros but had only ever seen blurry pictures of hippos and horses. It stood about 1.5 meters at the shoulder and weighed around a ton. It had a massive head with its eyes and nostrils positioned high up like a hippo. Its teeth were arranged in a distinctive bow shape, which is actually what its name means, bowtooth. Nothing alive today is related to it at all. Toxodon belonged to an order called Notungulata, southern hoofed animals. This entire order evolved during South America's isolation and has exactly 0 living descendants. When scientists recently extracted ancient proteins from Toxodon bones, they discovered it was most closely related to horses and rhinos, but had split from that lineage over 60 million years ago. And just when you thought Toxodon was the peak of weirdness, South America decided to raise the stakes even higher.
Meet Macrokenia. Imagine a camel with no hump. Give it a long, flexible neck, add legs built like a horse's,
designed for running, and then, for reasons that have baffled scientists for over a century, put its nostrils on top of its head, between its eyes, like a whale's blowhole. Yes, really. Some researchers think Macrocania had a short trunk, like a tapir. Others think a nose position helped it breathe while feeding in water. Others have just accepted that South America was doing its own thing, and we may never fully understand why. While these bizarre ungulates grazed the plains, the giant sloths weren't done surprising us either. Megatherium wasn't the only supersized sloth roaming around. There was also Eremotherium, another giant ground sloth that reached similar sizes and lived primarily in the tropical regions. Between them, these giant sloths had the high-browsing niche completely locked down. But remember those glyptodonts with their spiked tails? Well, they weren't the only animals turning their bodies into weapons. Some of the smaller ground sloths, like Mylodon, had bony nodules embedded in their skin, creating a kind of chainmail armor under their thick hide. Combined with their powerful claws, they were incredibly well defended. And while all these giant herbivores were doing their thing, the terror birds were still ruling the food chain. Smaller species of forest ratchet, standing only about 1.5 meters tall, filled different predatory niches. They were like the cheetahs to Kelenken's lion, faster, more agile, specialized for different prey. The diversity was staggering. You had armored giants, bizarre ungulates, supersized sloths, and carnivorous birds all existing in the same ecosystems. It was like every niche got filled by the weirdest possible solution. So how did it all end? How did 60 million years of evolutionary weirdness come crashing down? 2 words. Land bridge. About 3 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama rose from the sea. Suddenly, South America was connected to the rest of the world for the first time in over 60 million years. What followed is called the Great American Interchange. From the north came placental mammals, saber-toothed cats, wolves, bears, horses, deer, mastodons, animals that had been competing across vast connected land masses for tens of millions of years. They were battle-hardened, efficient, adaptable, and hungry. The North American animals swept south with devastating efficiency. Big cats established themselves quickly. Wolves spread across the continent. Within a few million years, North American species were everywhere in South America.
Next time you see a sloth moving at its glacial pace, remember that its relatives once shook the ground when they walked, that terror birds once ruled the plains where jaguars now hunt, that the continent beneath all of it was once, genuinely, the strangest place on Earth. Thanks for watching, and until next time on Extinct HQ.